April 12, 1945, 7:09 p.m., Washington, D.C. Harry S. Truman, Vice President for just 82 days, received the phone call that would fracture American power. Franklin Delano Roosevelt was dead. Within hours, Truman discovered something that would shake him more than the presidency itself. FDR's cabinet wasn't just Roosevelt's team. They were Roosevelt's empire, running a parallel government Truman knew nothing about, and they had no intention of letting a haberdasher from Missouri change that. April 12, 1945, 7:30 p.m. The cabinet room reeked of cigar smoke and expensive cologne, a suffocating blend that clung to velvet curtains drawn tight against spring rain hammering Pennsylvania Avenue. Harry Truman stood at the threshold, rain still dripping from his fedora, staring at 12 men who controlled the most powerful war machine in human history. They sat in Roosevelt's chairs, at Roosevelt's table, beneath Roosevelt's portrait. Not one stood when the new president entered. Secretary of State Edward Stettinius broke the silence first, his voice carrying the practiced condescension of Yale and Wall Street. "Mr. President, we've prepared briefing documents on ongoing diplomatic initiatives." Roosevelt had very specific instructions about Roosevelt's dead, Truman interrupted, his Missouri twang sharp as broken glass. "I'd appreciate knowing what instructions you're talking about." The silence that followed was arctic. Treasury Secretary Henry Morgenthau exchanged glances with Secretary of War Henry Stimson. Secretary of Commerce Henry Wallace leaned back with barely concealed contempt. Three Henrys, Truman thought. Roosevelt loved his Henrys. They'd run departments like medieval fiefdoms for 12 years, answering only to a man now cold in Warm Springs, Georgia. Truman had been vice president for 82 days. In that time, Roosevelt met with him twice. He knew nothing of the Manhattan Project, nothing of Roosevelt's private agreements with Stalin and Churchill, nothing of the vast web of executive orders, secret protocols, and gentlemen's agreements that constituted the real government of the United States. The formal government, the one with congressional oversight and constitutional checks, was window dressing. The real power sat in this room, looking at Truman like a temporary inconvenience. "Gentlemen," Truman said, sitting in Roosevelt's chair without invitation, "I need complete briefings on every active military operation, every diplomatic commitment, every secret agreement Roosevelt made. I need them within 48 hours. Attorney General Francis Biddle smiled thinly. "Mr. President, some of those materials are sensitive. Roosevelt maintained personal control over certain information channels. We'll need time to determine what's appropriate for presidential review." The words hung in the air like poison gas. Appropriate for presidential review. Truman felt his jaw tighten. These men were telling him, the President of the United States, that they would decide what he could know. The strategic situation made their arrogance comprehensible, if not forgivable. April 1945. Germany was collapsing, but 300,000 GIs were dying in the Pacific. The invasion of Japan, Operation Downfall, was projected to cost 1 million American casualties. The Soviet Union was supposed to be an ally, but was already seizing Eastern Europe. Britain was bankrupt. France was in ruins. The entire post-war order, the United Nations, the reconstruction of Europe, the atomic bomb, hung in balance. And these men believed they, not Truman, were the ones who could navigate that chaos. But there was another factor, one nobody mentioned, but everyone understood: prejudice. These were Roosevelt's men, Harvard lawyers, New York bankers, career diplomats who spoke French at dinner parties. Truman was a failed haberdasher from Independence, Missouri, who'd gone to night school and learned foreign policy from a county judge's desk. They saw him as an accident of history, a placeholder until someone serious could take charge. The facts were undeniable and terrifying. Secretary of State Stettinius had been conducting secret negotiations with the Soviets about Poland without War Department knowledge. Secretary of the Interior Harold Ickes controlled a slush fund of $40 million in unaudited appropriations. Secretary of Agriculture Claude Wickard had been implementing crop policies through executive order, bypassing Congress entirely. Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins, Roosevelt's only remaining original cabinet member, ran the Labor Department like a personal fiefdom, with policies unchanged since 1933. The most dangerous was Henry Wallace, Secretary of Commerce. Wallace had been vice president before Truman, pushed aside by Democratic bosses who considered him too radical. He still maintained contacts with Soviet officials, conducted his own foreign policy through Commerce Department channels, and spoke publicly about post-war cooperation with Stalin that contradicted State Department positions. Intelligence reports suggested Wallace was sharing classified economic data with Soviet trade representatives, though nothing could be proven. Truman spent his first week in office in a state of controlled terror. He couldn't trust the briefings he received because he didn't know what was being withheld. He couldn't issue orders with confidence because he didn't know what informal agreements might be contradicted. He couldn't even trust his own Secret Service detail. They'd been Roosevelt's men for 12 years. The breaking point came April 23rd. Truman called a National Security Council meeting to discuss Soviet violations of the Yalta agreements in Poland. He arrived to find the meeting had already started. Without him, Stettinius, Stimson, and Fleet Admiral William Leahy were in deep discussion, classified maps spread across the table. They looked surprised when Truman walked in. "We thought you were meeting with congressional leadership," Stettinius said smoothly. "That's at 3 hours," Truman replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "This meeting was scheduled for 2 hours. I scheduled it." "Apologies, Mr. President. Admiral Leahy mentioned you might be running late, so we started preliminary discussions." "Get out," Truman said. Stettinius blinked. "Sir, all of you, get out. The meeting is postponed until I say otherwise." That night, alone in the Oval Office at 11 p.m., Truman made his decision. The Constitution was clear. The President commanded the executive branch. These men worked for him, not for Roosevelt's ghost. If they couldn't accept that, they'd be replaced. All of them. The entire cabinet. It would be unprecedented, potentially catastrophic, given the war situation. But the alternative, presiding over a government he didn't control, was worse. He called in his appointments secretary. "Start compiling a list," Truman said. "I need candidates for every cabinet position, people I can trust, people who understand that in this government there's one president." The revolution had begun. April 25th, 1945, 6 a.m. Truman hadn't slept. The Oval Office was littered with files, coffee cups, and handwritten notes covering every surface. Outside, Washington was waking to another day of war, but inside this room, a different kind of war was beginning. The challenge was brutal in its complexity. Replacing 1 or 2 cabinet members was normal political transition. Replacing the entire cabinet during the largest war in human history was potentially catastrophic. These men controlled the machinery of total war production, military logistics, diplomatic relations with dozens of allied nations, intelligence operations across 6 continents. Remove them carelessly, and the entire apparatus could seize up like an engine stripped of oil. But keeping them was impossible. The previous day's revelation was worse than Truman imagined. His aide had discovered that Admiral Leahy, Roosevelt's chief of staff, maintained a private office in the East Wing, where he conducted what amounted to a shadow presidency. Leahy had been issuing directives to military commanders in Roosevelt's name, and continued doing so after Roosevelt's death. When confronted, Leahy was unapologetic. "The president's policies must continue uninterrupted." "I'm the president now," Truman had replied. "Of course, Mr. President," Leahy said, in a tone that meant the opposite. The organizational challenges were staggering. The cabinet controlled 2.3 million federal employees. The War Department alone employed 940,000 civilians, supporting 12 million military personnel. State Department operations spanned 147 embassies and consulates. Any disruption in leadership could cascade into operational failures, missed supply shipments, delayed intelligence, confused diplomatic signals. The human challenges were equally daunting. Most cabinet members had served since 1933. 12 years of accumulated knowledge, relationships, and institutional memory. Secretary Stimson, at 77, had served under 5 presidents, including Truman. He knew where every body was buried, every informal agreement, every quiet understanding that made Washington function. Replacing him meant losing that encyclopedic knowledge. The political challenges were potentially fatal. Congressional leaders were already nervous about Truman's inexperience. Wholesale cabinet replacement would trigger investigations, hostile hearings, media firestorms about Truman's purge. Allies abroad would interpret it as American political instability at the worst possible moment. Stalin would see it as weakness. Churchill, already mourning Roosevelt, would see it as the end of the special relationship they'd carefully built. Environmental factors added pressure. The war situation was critical. Germany would surrender within weeks, but the Pacific campaign was escalating. Okinawa was a bloodbath. 12,000 American casualties already, with projections reaching 50,000 before the island was secured. Intelligence indicated Japan was preparing for homeland defense, with 2.3 million troops and civilian militia numbering 28 million. The invasion of Kyushu, Operation Olympic, was scheduled for November 1, 1945. Changing leadership now meant new cabinet members would be making life-and-death decisions about operations they'd had no role in planning. The material challenges were equally severe. Washington in April 1945 was a city running on fumes. Gasoline was rationed at 3 gallons per week. Coal shortages meant federal buildings were heated to only 65 degrees. Paper shortages meant critical documents were typed on both sides, margins compressed. The entire federal apparatus was exhausted from 4 years of total war. Adding leadership chaos to material scarcity was dangerous. Truman's approach reflected his character, methodical, pragmatic, ruthlessly focused on essential problems. First, identify which cabinet positions were truly critical to immediate war operations. Stimson at War Department was essential, but Stimson had already offered to resign, recognizing the impossibility of his position. Replace him first cleanly, with someone competent but loyal. Second, identify which cabinet members were actively undermining presidential authority versus those who were simply resistant to change. The former had to go immediately. The latter could be persuaded or marginalized. Third, and most important, identify trustworthy candidates who combined competence with absolute loyalty. Truman needed people who understood that in this administration there would be one center of power, the president. They would not issue independent policy statements. They would not maintain private communication channels with foreign governments. They would not brief journalists without approval. They would not invoke Roosevelt's name to justify actions Truman hadn't authorized. The candidates emerged from Truman's network, built over 10 years in the Senate. James Burns for State, a South Carolina politician who'd served as Roosevelt's assistant president during the war but had been passed over for vice president. Burns understood power and wouldn't challenge Truman's authority. Robert Patterson for War, an appeals court judge, competent administrator, no political ambitions. John Snyder for Treasury, Truman's personal friend from Missouri, absolute loyalty guaranteed. The process began May 2nd. Truman called Stettinius to the Oval Office. "Ed, I need your resignation." Stettinius went pale. "Mr. President, the San Francisco conference opens in 3 weeks. I'm aware. You'll complete the United Nations negotiations, then step down. I'm appointing Jim Burns. Roosevelt chose me specifically for—" "Roosevelt's dead. I'm choosing Burns." The pattern repeated through May. Morgenthau at Treasury, gone. Biddle at Justice, gone. Wickard at Agriculture, gone. Ickes fought hardest, threatening to go public with accusations of political purge. Truman called his bluff, accepting his resignation immediately and announcing it before Ickes could control the narrative. Wallace at Commerce was the most dangerous. Truman reassigned him to a meaningless special envoy position before Wallace understood what was happening. By June 1945, 9 of 12 cabinet positions had new occupants. The old guard was gone. What remained was Truman's team, competent, loyal, and clear about the chain of command. The gamble was working, but the cost was high. Congressional investigations had begun. Media coverage was savage, Allied governments were nervous, and Truman had made powerful enemies among Washington's permanent establishment. But for the first time since April 12th, Truman controlled his own government. Moscow, May 15th, 1945. The Kremlin's intelligence directorate occupied a 19th-century building that reeked of stale tobacco and paranoia. Colonel Andrei Volkov stared at reports from Washington with growing unease. Something fundamental had changed in American governance, but he couldn't identify what. Soviet intelligence had invested 12 years cultivating relationships with Roosevelt's cabinet. They knew who was sympathetic to Soviet interests, who could be manipulated, who could be trusted to share information inadvertently. Wallace was a goldmine, genuinely believing in Soviet-American cooperation, sharing economic data freely. Morgenthau at Treasury had provided critical financial intelligence. Even the cautious ones like Stimson operated predictably within established frameworks. Then Truman became president, and within 30 days, the entire network evaporated. Wallace was neutralized. Morgenthau was gone. Stettinius, carefully cultivated over 2 years, was replaced by Burns, whom Soviet intelligence barely knew. The new cabinet was impenetrable. None of Roosevelt's informal communication channels existed anymore. The predictable American bureaucracy had been replaced by something opaque and dangerous. The doctrinal confusion was profound. Soviet military theory presumed American decision-making would be slow, bureaucratic, bound by congressional oversight and public opinion. Democratic systems were supposed to be weak in crisis, prone to committee-based paralysis. But Truman's purge demonstrated the opposite, ruthless, decisive action that no Soviet general could match within their own system without Stalin's personal approval. Stalin himself was unsettled. He'd developed a working relationship with Roosevelt based on mutual understanding of power politics. Roosevelt was duplicitous but predictable. He'd promised things to Stalin privately while saying the opposite publicly. Stalin understood that game. Truman was different, blunt, direct. When Truman's new Secretary of State Burns told Molotov that Soviet violations of the Yalta agreements were unacceptable, there was no diplomatic cushion, no room for interpretation, just a flat statement that America would not tolerate Soviet expansion into territories beyond what was explicitly agreed. The first direct confrontation came at the Potsdam Conference, July 1945. Stalin arrived expecting to negotiate with the same Americans he'd managed for 3 years. Instead, he found Truman, backed by an entirely new team, refusing to accept Soviet fait accompli in Poland. When Stalin invoked Roosevelt's Yalta promises, Truman cut him off. "I wasn't at Yalta. I'm here now. We're discussing what happens next." Stalin's translator later reported that Stalin seemed genuinely surprised. The Soviet leader had presumed American weakness after Roosevelt's death, internal conflict, political paralysis, leadership vacuum. Instead, he faced a consolidated executive more unified and decisive than Roosevelt's fractious coalition had ever been. Stalin couldn't understand how democratic transition had produced strength rather than vulnerability. British intelligence faced similar confusion. Churchill had lost the July election, replaced by Clement Attlee, but British diplomatic service maintained continuity. Their reports on Washington described unprecedented centralization of power. The State Department no longer operated semi-independently. Treasury wasn't conducting its own foreign policy. The cabinet functioned as Truman's staff, not as independent power centers. One British report noted with alarm, the American executive now more closely resembles a parliamentary system, with cabinet functioning as loyal ministers rather than departmental barons. The intelligence confusion had operational consequences. Soviet agents in Washington, cultivated for years, suddenly had no access. The sources were gone. The informal channels through which secrets naturally leaked in bureaucratic systems were sealed. Information security improved dramatically because Truman's cabinet understood that any leak could cost them their position. German intelligence officers, interrogated after surrender, expressed bewilderment. They'd counted on American political dysfunction delaying critical decisions. Instead, they'd watched American prosecution of the war accelerate after Roosevelt's death. Equipment deliveries improved, strategic decisions were made faster. The whole mechanism seemed to have shifted into higher gear precisely when it should have stalled. Japanese intelligence made the fatal error of interpreting cabinet changes as American political weakness. They calculated that Truman, inexperienced and embattled, would be reluctant to escalate the Pacific War. They were catastrophically wrong. Truman, freed from Roosevelt's cabinet's endless deliberations, made the atomic bomb decision with brutal efficiency. No committees, no competing power centers, just a clear chain of command ending with the president willing to make the hardest decision in human history. The deeper confusion was philosophical. Totalitarian systems presumed they were more efficient than democracies because unified leadership could act decisively. But Truman had created unified leadership within a democratic framework by doing something very simple, insisting that the executive branch have one executive. The innovation wasn't new bureaucratic structures or emergency powers. It was just enforcing the constitutional chain of command that had been allowed to atrophy under Roosevelt's personal diplomacy. By August 1945, foreign intelligence services had reached grudging conclusions. American governance had fundamentally changed. The Roosevelt system, personalized, relationship-based, opaque even to American institutions, was gone. The Truman system was transparent in structure, but impenetrable in practice. Everyone knew who made decisions. Nobody could subvert or bypass that structure. It was, paradoxically, a more powerful form of executive authority because it was legitimate, constitutional, and accountable. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki crystallized foreign perception. The decision demonstrated that Truman's consolidated command could execute the most momentous action in history with precision and without internal resistance. No cabinet member publicly opposed the decision. No leak warned Japan. No bureaucratic obstacle delayed implementation. Roosevelt might have agonized, consulted endlessly, sought consensus. Truman decided. The war ended August 15, 1945. Allied intelligence services filed final assessments of American governance transformation. The consensus, Truman's cabinet purge, had paradoxically strengthened American power by clarifying command structures. The leaderless transition period everyone feared had lasted less than 90 days. What emerged was more dangerous than what existed before. A democracy that could act with authoritarian efficiency while maintaining constitutional legitimacy. Moscow filed the reports. They would matter very soon. The Cold War was beginning. Washington, D.C., January 20th, 1949. Harry Truman stood on the Capitol steps, taking the oath for his second term as president. The crowd numbered 100,000, but the real audience was history itself. 4 years earlier, Truman had been an accidental president, given no chance of election. Now he'd won the greatest upset in American electoral history, defeating Thomas Dewey after every poll predicted his loss. The victory validated everything Truman had built from the ruins of Roosevelt's empire. The cabinet purge of 1945 became textbook study in executive governance. What seemed like political chaos at the time revealed itself as necessary reconstruction. Every president after Roosevelt had faced the same challenge: how to govern within institutions designed by your predecessor. Eisenhower would face Truman's cabinet. Kennedy would face Eisenhower's. Each transition raised the question Truman answered definitively: the president must control the executive branch, or the executive branch will control the president. The constitutional transformation was profound but subtle. Truman didn't change laws or expand presidential powers. He simply enforced the Constitution as written. Executive power was vested in the president, not in cabinet secretaries or senior bureaucrats. Cabinet members were appointed to execute presidential policy, not to create independent policy domains. The innovation was returning to original intent rather than creating new structures. The historical impact manifested in multiple dimensions. First, administrative. The modern cabinet system traces directly to Truman's reformation. Cabinet meetings transformed from policy debates among equals to briefings where department heads reported to the president. The distinction mattered enormously. Under Roosevelt, cabinet members argued policy and built coalitions to override presidential preferences. Under Truman, policy was decided by the president, and cabinet implemented it. This model persisted through subsequent administrations, becoming standard practice. Second, national security. Truman's consolidation enabled creation of modern national security architecture. The National Security Council, established by the 1947 National Security Act, functioned effectively because Truman had already established clear presidential authority over foreign policy and military affairs. If Roosevelt's fractious cabinet system had continued, the NSC would have been another arena for competing bureaucratic empires. Instead, it became what Truman intended: a coordinating body serving presidential decision-making. Third, Cold War effectiveness. The cabinet transformation proved crucial to American Cold War strategy. The Marshall Plan, the Berlin airlift, the formation of NATO, the decision to intervene in Korea, all required rapid, decisive presidential action. A Roosevelt-style cabinet, with competing power centers pursuing semi-independent policies, couldn't have executed the sustained strategic coherence that contained Soviet expansion. Truman's unified command structure enabled America to lead the free world because Allied nations knew they were dealing with the president, not with a committee. The human dimension was equally significant. Truman's new cabinet members, Burns, Acheson, Marshall, Forrestal, became architects of post-war order. But their effectiveness derived from something deeper than individual brilliance. They understood their role: execute the president's policy with competence and loyalty. When they disagreed with Truman, they argued privately and then implemented his decision. When they couldn't serve under those terms, they resigned rather than undermine him. This created functional trust that enabled aggressive policy implementation. The personal cost to Truman was substantial, but rarely discussed. The cabinet purge made him enemies among Washington's permanent establishment. Journalists close to Roosevelt's team portrayed Truman as a small-minded politician destroying FDR's legacy. Academic historians, many personally connected to New Deal intellectuals, wrote dismissive assessments that persisted for decades. The characterization of Truman as an accidental president in over his head originated partly from officials he fired who had platforms to shape historical narrative. But the deeper vindication came from results measurable decades later. Every aspect of post-war success, economic reconstruction, alliance building, successful containment of Soviet expansion, rested on institutional foundations Truman built by insisting on constitutional governance. When documents were declassified in the 1970s and 1980s, historians discovered the extent of chaos under Roosevelt's personalized system. Secret agreements nobody knew about, contradictory commitments to different allies, bureaucratic fiefdoms operating without coordination. Truman's purge looked less like political opportunism and more like necessary reform. The parallel government problem Truman confronted never fully disappeared. It's inherent in large bureaucracies. But Truman established precedent that presidents could cite. Executive branch authority flows from the president, and officials who can't accept that must leave. Reagan invoked it firing air traffic controllers. Clinton cited it during battles with independent counsels. Obama referenced it consolidating national security decision-making. The principle remained, in the American system, there's one executive. The Cold War's end in 1991 provided final historical verdict. The Soviet Union, with its supposedly efficient command structure, collapsed. The American system, with its raucous democracy and contentious politics, prevailed. But American success required something the founders understood: effective executive power within constitutional constraints. Roosevelt's personalized government threatened that balance. Truman restored it. The final irony: Truman's cabinet purge, criticized as authoritarian at the time, proved to be democracy's salvation. By insisting that executive authority be constitutional rather than personal, Truman ensured the presidency remained an institution rather than degenerating into personality cult. Future presidents would be powerful, but their power would derive from the office, not from personal relationships or bureaucratic empires. That was the revolution, not expanding presidential power, but constitutionalizing it. Today, the 1945 cabinet purge appears in history texts as a footnote to World War II's end. But its significance exceeded the military victories it enabled. Truman proved that democratic governance could be decisive, efficient, and powerful while remaining constitutional. He proved that strength comes from clarity of authority, not from complexity of bureaucracy. He proved that a failed haberdasher from Missouri could master the most powerful government on earth by insisting on a simple principle: the Constitution means what it says. The parade passed down Pennsylvania Avenue. Truman waved to crowds who'd been told he couldn't win, but voted for him anyway. They understood something the experts missed. Competence matters more than pedigree. Character matters more than charisma. And sometimes the most radical act is simply following the Constitution as written. The accidental president had become the indispensable president. The cabinet purge that nearly destroyed him had transformed American governance. And the revolution nobody recognized in 1945 had secured American victory in the 50-year struggle that followed. The legacy endures. Every president since Truman has benefited from the precedent he established. Executive power is vested in the president, and anyone who forgets that will be reminded or removed. What aspects of Truman's decisive leadership resonate most with you? Do you think modern presidents face similar challenges with entrenched bureaucracies? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this deep dive into the hidden power struggles that shaped America's post-war dominance, hit that subscribe button for more untold stories from history's most critical moments. Thanks for watching.